Bring everybody in. So we have nice background noise of some kind of power machine out back. Folks at home, can you hear me? Someone give me a nod. Yeah, okay. All right, here we go. Today we have finish up the Dormant Commerce Clause, as well as to do the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4. Just a quick review of the methodology for the Dormant Commerce Clause. One, determine that there must be a state law. The Dormant Commerce Clause reviews state statutes usually, or state law that has been passed to see if it involves commerce. If it involves commerce, there is a potential Dormant Commerce Clause issue. Remembering that the purpose of the Dormant Commerce Clause is to prevent states from discriminating against out-of-staters, usually out-of-state businesses, or to protect in-state businesses, and often they both go together. Remembering that that's the purpose of it, read the statute to make a determination whether there is a facial discrimination, whether within the four corners of that law, it actually clearly discriminates against out-of-state businesses. If it is a facial discrimination, use strict scrutiny, which means you're going to almost always find there's a violation of the clause. I'm getting some feedback here, which means that someone may have their speaker a little too high in the classroom. That's usually when it happens. Maybe it's because I'm yelling too much. So strict scrutiny. Is there any other means to advance a legitimate local purpose? In other words, is this statute overbroad? Is it not narrowly tailored? Okay. And that's very, very difficult to show. There must be some other non-discriminatory measure in most cases. So again, if it does facially discriminate, it will be subject to strict scrutiny and will violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. Even if it is not facially discriminatory, you have to look at the impact that the law is going to have on interstate commerce. Is it still a discriminatory effect on interstate commerce, or does it substantially interfere with interstate commerce? Even if it's facially neutral and it substantially interferes with interstate commerce, it is still going to be subject to strict scrutiny, which means the state is going to have a hard time justifying it. It has to show that there's no other non-discriminatory way in order to achieve the goals that it's trying to achieve. Very often, of course, these goals are going to be consumer protection goals or other police power goals that's reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. If the state law is facially neutral, but only incidentally affects interstate commerce, then we use the Pike balancing test. And we'll look at the Pike case today. We're going to talk about fruits and trucks and trains today. That's what the cases tend to involve. Pike versus Bruce Church Inc. involved cantaloupes that were grown in Arizona. Okay. So with Pike, you do a balancing test. You balance the nature of the local interest involved against the impact on interstate commerce. If the local interest involved is a substantial one and the impact is minimal, then the law is going to be okay. It will be upheld. It will not be deemed to violate the Dormant Commerce Clause. If, however, the law is, I think maybe I have to turn down my speaker. I think that's probably the problem. Are you guys hearing feedback as well, or is it just me? Just me, so I probably have my,
No, I'm hearing an echo and it's hard to hear you.
yeah.
You
Okay,
hear that? Yeah, you heard me?
so yeah, there is a bit of an echo, but I think that's because I have my speaker up too loud, so I'm going to turn it down. Okay, so I'm still echoing. Uh, so um, um, if the impact on interstate commerce is minimal, then we're not going to have a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause. Okay. Now, if you determine that there is a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause, then you have to look at whether the matter falls within one of the exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause. And as we've discussed briefly in the last class, the one that's going to appear most often on the bar exam is the so-called market participant exception. If the state is sort of in the business of doing what it is discriminating in regard to, then it falls within this market participant exception. It acts more like a business than like a market regulator, and there would be no violation. In the example that I gave you before is the state that's running a state university system that charges higher tuitions to out-of-staters. Because the state is running the business of a university, it's conducting the business itself of a university rather than just regulating private universities within the state. Because it's acting as a business participant, the market participant exception applies. And then I also give you the case of White versus Massachusetts Council of Construction Employers, Inc. City of Boston required a certain percent, 50% of the workforce to be Boston residents. Since this was only city projects that were being done on city land and on city buildings, Boston was acting more as a business participant than as a market regulator. Therefore, this one applied. And the second exception is, since Congress has essentially plenary power over interstate commerce, if Congress if Congress allows discrimination in the marketplace, then the state is free to discriminate in the marketplace. So this is the so-called congressional approval exception to the Dormant Commerce Clause. So let's run through the cases. We have a fair number of them here. The first is H.P. Hood and Sons, Inc. versus Dumont, 1949 case. Anyone been to Fort Point Channel in Boston recently and seen the milk bottle that's there? It's sort of a historic milk bottle that used to be there. It was a Hood milk bottle, and they actually used to have a little sandwich shop that ran out of it. It's right down by the Children's Museum at Fort Point Channel in Boston. Hood has been around forever. It's probably the largest milk producer in certainly the greater Boston area. But it also does work throughout the Northeast, or it sells throughout the Northeast. Hood maintained 3 milk receiving depots in New York. It wanted to build a 4th. It applied to the State Commissioner of Agriculture for a license to construct a 4th receiving depot. The commissioner denied the application following New York law. The New York law said that the commissioner cannot issue a license unless he or she, and given it was 1949, I'm going to guess it was he, unless he was satisfied that there would be no destructive competition in a market already adequately served. So clearly, on the face of the New York law, what is it doing? It's discriminating against out-of-state milk producers, will not let them come in and create more competition. You know, one of the things to always remember is that our laws are going to support our economic system. And we have a free market economic system. And the hallmark of a free market economy is competition. Competition usually means lower prices. Greater competition usually means lower prices, and lower prices are better for the consumers. It means that they'll buy more, and it means that it will be better for the economy, okay? So this is, you know, one of the reasons here, obviously, behind the Dormant Commerce Clause rules, is that you want to promote competition, whether that competition is from out of state or in state. And if you suppress out of state competition, it will often result in higher prices. So in any event, that's, you know, the aside here. So what I'm suggesting is, you know, always think about the purposes behind these rules. Supreme Court found what we just obviously saw was this law on its face is discriminatory against out-of-state competition. It is essentially economic protectionism. If there's a determination that the market is adequately served, and you foreclose others from coming in from out of state, you're preventing competition from out of state, and you're keeping the prices up higher. Much more recent case, equally as easy, I think, is the Tennessee Wine and Spirits Retailers Association case versus Thomas. Interesting a case. When I first started practicing law, I worked for a bigger firm in Boston, and they did a lot of liquor licensing work and common vitular licensing work. Common vitular licensing is the food industry, and they represented the liquor industry at both the wholesale level, retail level, and production level. Massachusetts, so the 18th Amendment created the prohibition. It said that, you know, with a few exceptions, alcohol could not be served in the United States. Imbibing in alcoholic beverages was illegal in the United States. The 21st Amendment abolished the 18th Amendment and then left most of the regulatory processes to the states. It allowed the states to deal with the regulation of alcohol. And, you know, the states have done this very, very differently. If you look in Massachusetts, what you see is that you can buy beer and wine mostly only in liquor stores in Massachusetts. And with a few exceptions, you will not see beer and wine sold in grocery stores like Market Basket or Stop and Shop. Go across the border to New Hampshire, and you see that all the hard liquor is sold in state liquor stores. You can't buy that anywhere else but in a state liquor store, which isn't the case in Massachusetts. And you can buy beer and wine in supermarkets and grocery stores. Now, the reason for this in Massachusetts is there's a local law, you know, a state law that says you cannot own more than 3 retail alcohol establishments. So there are only 3 market baskets in the state of Massachusetts that can sell beer and wine. There are only 3 Stop and Shops in the state of Massachusetts. There are only 3 BJ's. There are only 3 Costco's that can sell beer and wine in Massachusetts, okay? That's obviously a different scheme in New Hampshire. Go to Maine and you'll find yet a different scheme. So in this case, obviously involves the licensing of retail liquor establishments. So rather than having a limit on the number that you can have, what Tennessee has is a residency requirement, a durational residency requirement. No one can be given a license to sell liquor at the retail stage of the process unless they have lived in the state for 2 years, and they don't get renewal unless they have been continuing to live in the state for the past 10 years. Um, the um, um, Someone from out of state applies for the liquor licenses, and the Tennessee Alcoholic Beverage Commission, the TABC, is about to grant the licenses, and this trade group brings an action. The Tennessee Wine and Spirits Retailers Association brings an action to enjoin the issuance to out-of-staters, more competition, obviously, and the in-staters are trying to prevent this additional competition. The Supreme Court finds that this violates the Dormant Commerce Clause, and with good reason. The law on its face is discriminatory against out-of-state businesses. Obviously, if you prevent someone from opening up a retail liquor establishment unless they've lived there, someone who's typing, I would suggest to you that you put on your mute button. Please make sure your mute button is on unless you're speaking, okay? Because I'm picking up typing, loud typing that's coming in over the feed here. So the court finds this is a facial violation, and this interferes with interstate commerce. So they shoot it down. Then they look at the next question. In these liquor cases, this always arises. The next question is, well, wait a second, but the 21st Amendment gives us the authority to essentially do anything we want in regard to the regulation of alcohol. So the 21st Amendment essentially trumps the Dormant Commerce Clause. And the court says, no, the 21st Amendment was meant to constitutionalize the retail sale of liquor, and it gave the states broad power to regulate, but nothing in the 21st Amendment says that they can do so in a way that otherwise violates the Constitution of the United States. Here, that's what you would be doing. You'd be violating the Dormant Commerce Clause. You'd be sucking off powers from Congress, who has the right to engage in interstate, has the right to regulate interstate commerce, okay? One more case of facial discrimination. These are the ones you like to see because they're the easiest. City of Philadelphia versus New Jersey. This is a case about garbage. I should have mentioned with cantaloupes and avocados and apples and trucks and trains that we'd also be talking about garbage as well. New Jersey, New Jersey's not such a bad state. I think most of us get our impression of New Jersey by driving on the highways. And we see a lot of industrialization as we drive down the highways. But there are, of course, beautiful rural areas of New Jersey as well. Yes, there are. Northwestern New Jersey is very, very rural and very, very nice. Very wealthy as well.
Like Bernardsville and Morris, Mendham, there's huge.
Morristown, and in fact, New Jersey has a big problem with the overpopulation of deer, and they allow a much longer hunting season. And deer like to hang out in woods, not in urban industrial areas. And you guys know why they allow longer hunting seasons. You don't want too many deer, is because of Lyme disease, right? Deer ticks are what spread Lyme disease. In any event, back to our subject here. So one of the big industries that's being handled in New Jersey is running what we now call transfer stations, which used to be called landfills, which used to be called dumps when I was a kid, the processing of trash, of waste. Apparently, so many out-of-state businesses were taking their waste to New Jersey. You know, when you think about it, those private dump trucks that come down your street and pick up your garbage have to take that trash to a larger facility, which usually then takes it to a larger, even larger facility for, you know, permanent burying or doing whatever they do with it. So there was so much out-of-state business coming in that the New Jersey landfills were becoming full, and New Jersey decided to control this by saying that from now on, the New Jersey landfills are only going to take New Jersey garbage. New Jersey garbage is better than other garbage. We're going to service the local people, but not the out-of-state people. And this is challenged by the city of Philadelphia, who needs to send its garbage somewhere. Those of you who have been to Philadelphia must know that if you cross the Ben Franklin Bridge, you're in New Jersey, right? Camden is just over the bridge, and there are a lot of Philadelphia suburbs that are in New Jersey. Not necessarily, there are obviously a lot in Pennsylvania too, but there are a lot in New Jersey. So this gets challenged, and what does the court say here? Facial discrimination. This regulation is clearly discriminating against out-of-state business, people who want to bring their trash in from out of state. New Jersey cannot isolate itself from the stream of interstate commerce from a problem that is shared by all, okay? So let's move on and look at some facially neutral laws. And these are the tougher ones. And I guess the best way to sort of go through them. So remember, two things here. Number one, even if it's facially neutral, it still might have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. If that is the case, we still use strict scrutiny. The state or the political subdivision of the state must then show there's no other non-discriminatory way of achieving the goal that it's seeking to achieve, okay? If, however, the effect on interstate commerce is only incidental, we apply the Pike balancing test, and we balance the local interest against the effect on interstate commerce. If the effect on interstate commerce is minimal, and the local interest is a valid police power interest, then the local interest is going to prevail. Another way of saying the same thing, if the local interest is substantial and the effect on interstate commerce is minimal, then the local interest is going to prevail. But the converse is true as well. If the local interest is either minimal or the effect on interstate commerce is substantial, and it can't be so substantial to make it a strict scrutiny test, but if it's still more substantial than the local interest, if it balances out in favor of the burden on interstate commerce, then the local law will be declared unconstitutional, violative of the Dormant Commerce Clause, okay? Our first case is Hunt versus Washington State Apple Advertising Commission. You guys probably remember that California is very proud of its avocados from the case that we did in the last class. Well, Washington State appears to be equally proud of its apples.
Professor, I'm sorry, Professor, this is Jade. There's a lot of echoing and feedback.
Yeah, everyone has to make sure that their speakers, everyone in class, make sure your speakers are not too loud. And everyone who is not talking has to make sure that they're on mute, okay? And I don't think I'm not being picked up. This speaker system is not on in here, is it? That you guys know of? Yeah, we've never had this problem before, and I'm not sure what's.
You know what? I'm gonna shut mine off just in case, because I'm just gonna look on
You
this.
think you're the culprit?
I don't know. I haven't been around for a while.
You have the you have the right to remain silent.
I think
Okay.
that was it. Yay.
Uh-huh. Am I echoing now? No, I don't hear the feedback at all.
No.
I don't hear the feedback at all. So, and were you on mute? And it was still, huh? Okay.
He wasn't
All right.
on mute.
Let's start again. We'll go back to Hunt. Well, we're not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the class. If you want to review this class later on and you listen to it and the echo sounds too much, I would recommend then trying the night class. They're basically the same class. Obviously, the night class doesn't get done. Do you guys know what time I go home at night?
11 o'clock.
No, I'm home before midnight, but my class goes until 10:40. So I'm usually leaving the building at about quarter of 11 for the night owls. Hey, that's my life. I'm a hardworking guy. Okay. So North Carolina produces apples as Washington State produces apples. How do you like them apples? Washington State has its own grading system for apples. And the grading system is a more stringent, a higher grading system than the USDA grading system. Now, most of us are familiar with the USDA grading system for meat. You know, there are different, for example, there are different cuts of beef under the USDA grading system, the highest of which is prime. Something like, 2% of all beef is prime. I think the next is choice, and I forget what the next one down is. These grading standards that the USDA has are very different for all the different products. So there is one when it comes to grading apples, but it is not a very stringent grading process. The one that Washington State uses is a much more stringent grading process. And obviously Washington State is using it because it is convinced that its apples are of better quality than the apples from other states, okay? Now notice that there's a big difference here from the avocado case that we talked about in the last class. The avocado case, the USDA grading standard was based on entirely different criteria than the California grading system for avocados. Here, the same criteria are being used for the most part, except that the Washington State one requires, higher marks. And so it gives like what I guess in the industry is sort of known as the gold standard of grading apples. So North Carolina says if you don't use the USDA standard, you don't get to sell apples in North Carolina. So it's essentially trying to shut out Washington State apples. And again, Washington State is claiming that its apples are better, okay? Now it raises a couple of things. Number one is it's doing it because it wants to create uniformity. And number two is it wants to protect the citizenry from fraud and deception. And those are obviously justifications that are essentially pretense. It's really looking to prevent an out-of-state shipper coming in and competing with North Carolina producers of apples. Is this something that is facially discriminatory against out-of-staters? And the answer is no. Because what does North Carolina say? North Carolina doesn't say everyone from out of state has to use USDA, but everyone in state doesn't have to. That would be facially discriminatory. What does it say instead? Everyone has to use the USDA standard, or you can't sell apples in Washington state. And this would, obviously cause the Washington state apples to go through greater expense to comply with two grading standards as opposed to just, its own superior grading standard. So the argument is it affects in-state apple producers, North Carolina apple producers, as much as it affects out-of-state apple producers. So this is one that is not discriminatory on its face. It applies equally to in-state apple producers and out-of-state apple producers, which means it's a facially neutral law rather than a facially discriminatory law. Okay? Does
There was one
everyone
bad
see that?
apple. There was one
that?
rotten apple. No, I'm kidding. There's one rotten apple. It only takes one rotten apple in the bunch.
There you go. One more rotten apple will do it. So there's an argument for pretty clearly facially neutral. Okay, but that's not the end of the discussion, because now we have to determine, okay, facially neutral, but what effect does it have on interstate commerce? Does it have a substantial effect on interstate commerce or only an incidental effect on interstate commerce? If it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce, we're going to have to find strict scrutiny applies. It's just as bad as a facial discrimination. And you can see why the court has done this, right? Because, people who draft these laws are not stupid. They know what the law is, and they know that if they facially discriminate against out-of-staters, the law, in order to protect intrastate business, then the law is going to be shot down. So what do? They find a way of helping the local businesses through a facially neutral law. And so the court can see through that and says, and then goes to the next step. Now we need to, I'm sorry, it's not balanced. Now we need to see what the effect on interstate commerce is. And here you have a unanimous Supreme Court that says that the effect on interstate commerce is substantial. It's not just incidental. This is an attempt to gain a competitive advantage for local businesses by keeping out someone who has better apples, someone whose apples are graded by stricter standards, rather than letting them in. So you're essentially discriminating against a superior product in order to protect the local business, and this is an unreasonable burden on interstate commerce, okay? Now, if you can understand the Hunt case that we just did, the apples case that we just did, I submit that you're not going to understand the Exxon versus Governor of Maryland case, because I don't see them as being all that consistent with each other, to be honest. So the state, is Maryland a Commonwealth? Pennsylvania is a Commonwealth, Kentucky is a Commonwealth, Massachusetts is a Commonwealth.
I don't think so.
I don't know, I think Maryland might be a Commonwealth, but I'm not sure, whatever.
Virginia.
We'll say the state of Maryland for our purposes. So the state observes that, say Exxon, well, let's back up a minute. There are generally two types of gasoline filling stations. There are independent gasoline filling stations that enter into franchise agreements with, the big petroleum producers. Exxon, Shell, Sunoco, whatever. They're locally owned, and they get their gas through a franchise agreement with an oil producer, okay, a gas producer. And there are also retail gas stations that are owned by the big gas producers themselves. So in this case, Exxon owns some local retail filling stations in the state of Maryland, okay? And so what is observed is that Exxon charges lower prices for its own retail establishments than it does when it's in a franchise agreement for a locally owned Exxon station. So Maryland says this isn't fair. This is the big guys getting an advantage over the local little guys. So it creates a law that says Exxon can't own a retail filling station in Maryland, okay? The big guys who are out of state can't, and there are no refineries in Maryland. So obviously Exxon does not have a local presence. It's an out-of-state presence. So in this case, the claim is, well, this is facially neutral, because if there were an oil producer, then it also wouldn't be able to operate gas stations as well. Okay, you would have to enter into franchise agreements. That's the sort of counter argument. The Supreme Court says, kind of curiously, quite frankly, that this is not a problem at all. This does not have a substantial impact on interstate commerce. Although there are no local producers, the claim of disparate treatment is meritless, because it applies to both in-state oil producers and out-of-state oil producers. Maryland doesn't discriminate against interstate dealers. It doesn't prohibit the flow of interstate goods. There's no evidence that it places added cost on oil products. The statute does not distinguish between in-state or out-of-state real retailers, okay? So this one is constitutional. The court admits that there are huge extraterritorial effects on regulation, admits that there are less burdensome options available to the state, it still says that this one doesn't violate. Justice Blackmun wrote the dissent, and he said, this is clear discrimination against interstate commerce in a retail gasoline market. It precludes out-of-state competitors because there are no in-state oil retailers. The effect is really to protect local businesses, and this is what the Dormant Commerce Clause is all about. So again, I don't care which side of the argument you're on, I think you can all see the sort of inconsistency in application between the last two cases here. West Lynn Creamery versus Healy, another local milk producing business. I once represented a dairy farmer when I used to practice law full time. And I learned from the dairy farmer that dairy farming is a hugely regulated industry, mostly by the states, not by the federal government. And so here we have a system where, regardless of where your milk is being produced, okay, if it is being sold in Massachusetts, it is going to be taxed. And the tax is $15 on every 100 pounds of raw milk. So on its face, that part of this law has no problem with the Dormant Commerce Clause, right? Because on its face, it taxes in-state dairy farmers equally to out-of-state dairy farmers. But here's the rub. It then takes the money that it gets from collecting the tax and pays it right back to the Massachusetts dairy farmers who had paid it. So in other words, a good chunk of that tax that local dairy farmers produce gets erased by the subsidy that comes back, okay? And the reason for this is because the dairy farmers in Massachusetts, one, aren't making a whole bunch of money, but number two, they're not competing at the same level with the out-of-state producers for the Massachusetts market, okay? So this is facially neutral. On its face, it does not discriminate. Although I would suggest if you read the entire statute, it might look like it does discriminate. If you look at it as a whole, it looks like it might be facially. But the court treats it as if it's facially neutral. But it still applies strict scrutiny, and it does so because of the substantial effect on interstate commerce. And here are the reasons why. It lists them out. The undisputed purpose was to enable higher cost Massachusetts dairy farmers to compete with lower cost dairy farmers in other states. The tax was purely an out-of-state tax, in effect. This will prop up the local market and damage the out-of-state market, and of clear benefit to the local market, clear detriment to the other market. And the local benefit, here's the heart of the Pike balancing test that we're about to look at in a minute. The local benefit is outweighed by the burden on commerce, okay? Burden of benefiting local farmers. Minnesota versus Clover Leaf Creamery. Minnesota law says no more milk in plastic returnable bottles, okay? I'm old enough to remember when you could only buy milk in glass bottles that the milkman would leave in a galvanized box on your back porch.
I remember that too.
Yeah. Actually, we still have a milkman who does that, believe it or not. He picks up the old bottles and brings the new ones. It's kind of a nice service to have, especially in the pandemic. Carton, essentially wax paper carton milk containers. Those are the ones that had the missing kids, on the milk cartons. That became big for a while. And then eventually, plastic containers became much more popular. I think most of us probably buy our milk in plastic containers, non-returnable plastic containers these days, and then just recycle them at curbside in most communities, at least in Massachusetts. Well, the problem is, you understand that a very small percentage of plastic that is put into your recycle bin actually gets recycled. It's really hard to recycle plastic, and it's not all that economically worthwhile. So it does all end up in, most of it ends up in landfills anyways. And this is obviously an environmental problem that Minnesota was worried about. And Minnesota certainly had it within their police power authority to try to prevent this type of non-recyclable trash from filling up landfills and taking up land. So Minnesota passes a law that prohibits the sale in milk in these plastic containers. It's got to be returnable glass, or it's got to be paperboard milk cartons. And the Clover Loaf Creamery challenges this, says that these out-of-state businesses are operating under different laws, so it probably already produces most of its milk in plastic containers. And now if it wants to sell it in Minnesota, it's got to create its own packaging system for the milk, just for Minnesota and for nowhere else. And that's obviously going to come at a high price, it is what it's claiming. Now, obviously, this is not a facially discriminatory statute, because it applies equally to Minnesota milk producers, dairy producers, equally to them as it does to out-of-state dairy producers, okay? So then the question is going to be, does it have a substantial burden on interstate commerce? Does that burden on interstate commerce? And the court says no, it's not a substantial burden on interstate commerce. Then under the Pike balancing test, you know, we weigh that against the local burden, and they say there's a pretty substantial state interest involved here, keeping the environment clean. It probably will have a big economic effect. As landfills grow, it means less usable land for other purposes. So the court found that this one was facially neutral, and even if it did have a substantial effect, I'm sorry, it didn't have a substantial effect on interstate commerce, only incidental, and then when balanced against the local interest involved, the local interest won out, okay? Here are cases where the local interest will not win out. We begin with Dean Milk versus the city of Madison, Wisconsin. I believe the biggest city in Wisconsin. It's also home to the University of Wisconsin. The city of Madison has an ordinance that prohibits the sale of milk within the city limits unless it came from a local farm or was pasteurized at an approved plant within 5 miles of the center of Madison. So this is a so-called farm-to-table law, right? We're going to make everybody in Madison drink milk that is either produced in Madison or within 5 miles of Madison. Dean Milk Company is located in Illinois. They share a common boundary, Illinois and Wisconsin. And it is denied the ability to sell milk, so it sues, saying that this is discriminatory against out-of-staters. Now again, look, this is not discriminatory on its face, is it? Because this also burdens Wisconsin dairy farmers who are more than 5 miles outside of Madison, right? Okay, so you have to dig a little deeper to see what the effect on interstate commerce was. And the court here says that this violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. It imposed an undue burden on interstate commerce. The local goal that Madison was trying to achieve was not narrowly tailored to assert the city's interests. There are reasonable, non-discriminatory alternatives that are involved. This had a huge burden on interstate commerce. Really what they're doing here, I'm going back to our recap. Really what they're doing here is, I don't mean to make you dizzy. Really what they're doing here is they're saying that the city of Madison does have other means to achieve a legitimate local purpose, which is to assure fresh milk, to protect the health and safety of its citizens. It can just impose, you know, shipping standards and the like on those who ship from out of state, or it can create a grading system like we have with apples and avocados in order to make sure that the milk is wholesome and the like. So this one they find facially neutral but substantially affects interstate commerce. They still apply strict scrutiny. They use kind of other words to do it, but they apply the strict scrutiny test that we defined up front, and held this to be unconstitutional, okay? Maine versus Taylor. Maine says, the state of Maine says that no bait fish can come into the state of Maine from out of state. All bait fish must be Maine bait fish, okay? This guy, Robert Taylor, the owner of a bait business, violates the law, and Maine authorities prosecute him. Now, the purpose of this is to prevent parasites and other non-native species from getting into the waters of Maine. This is a legitimate concern. Has anyone ever heard of zebra mussels? Does anyone know the problem with zebra mussels?
We had them in Lake Erie in Ohio. They kind of clog things, and they're not a native species, but they reproduce really fast, and they have a lot of staying power.
Yeah, so they apparently came in from the bilges and the hulls of cargo ships that came from somewhere, I believe, the South Pacific. I think they're indigenous to the South Pacific. And they attached themselves to the hulls of ships. And then when the ships came in through the St. Lawrence Seaway and into the Great Lakes, these zebra mussels would then be deposited into the Great Lakes, and they reproduce like rabbits, essentially, like crazy. And they cause a lot of problems. So you have essentially a non-indigenous species that really shouldn't be there that's creating local problems, right? Has anyone ever put firewood in the back of their car and driven over a state line? Well, it's unlawful to do so. You will be fined if you are stopped by the state police and they see the firewood that is there. Most states have the exception that you can only do it if it is kiln-dried firewood. And it's sort of a similar purpose as this bait fish thing, which is to produce out-of-state parasites from coming in. Go ahead, unmute yourself and go right ahead. I think you're in trouble. So you can buy at supermarkets and other places these, I don't know, they probably have 8 or 10 sticks of firewood. They're wrapped in plastic and they have a little handle on them. Almost all of that is kiln dried. So you're probably okay. And the reason I know this all is because I also represented a guy who did firewood before with all these laws. And obviously the kiln drying will kill the parasites. That's why they allow that to be transported from out of state. But otherwise, no in most cases. And then in Maine, if I'm bringing a boat in to Maine on a trailer and I have out of state plates, my boat is supposed to be inspected at a local inspection place to make sure that there's nothing attached to it that's a parasite that might be a problem. So I guess the reason I've gone into these sort of analogies is to sort of set up the fact that Maine does have a legitimate reason for this, and I think the Supreme Court recognizes this. It says that Maine has a substantial justification for what they're doing. It's a legitimate concern. And how else are you going to keep these parasites that come in from out-of-state bait fish from coming into the states? Think about it. Do you remember when Lyme disease first came to the attention of all of us? I remember that it started in the Northeast, and there are only 1 or 2 states, Connecticut, from Lyme, Connecticut, apparently, or at least that's the name it was given. 1 or 2 states had it, and then it kept spreading and spreading and spreading, right? So a lot of states are going to take these measures to prevent these types of scourges. Gypsy moths would be a similar example. And so the court here, deems Maine's local purpose to be substantial, and it determines that there really are no other non-discriminatory alternatives it could have taken to prevent this from happening. You know, inspecting a boat is a lot easier than inspecting every little bait fish that comes in for parasites, right? Parasites aren't always easily visible during an inspection. And here we go into the pike balancing test, pike v. Bruce Church Inc. Balancing test. This is what gives us this balance the local interest against the effect on interstate commerce balancing test. And as I mentioned in the last class, a pretty wide open balancing test. One that will suit the purposes of the judge in determining which interest weighs more. And, you know, add to that the natural tendency of some judges to favor federal interests and other judges to favor state interests over federal interests. And then you see, you know, why there are dissents in these cases. Here, Bruce Church grew cantaloupes, grew them in Arizona, but apparently found in Arizona near the California border, a few miles from the California border apparently, and apparently finds that there's a facility in California that is much cheaper to package them in and label them in than in Arizona. So it hauls the cantaloupes just a few miles into California rather than a farther distance within Arizona, gets them packaged pretty cheaply, and then sends them out. Arizona passes a law that says that all cantaloupes that are grown in Arizona must advertise their state of origin on each package. Now, for Bruce to have done this would have cost him an additional $200,000 on a $700,000 crop. That's a big chunk out of the profit that he's going to be making here. So he sues, and again, this doesn't seem to be facially discriminatory because it applies to Arizona growers of cantaloupes. So it doesn't seem to discriminate against out-of-staters. Now we look at it. Does it have a substantial effect on interstate commerce? The court says no. So now we balance the local interest against the effect on interstate commerce. And here's a pretty huge burden on Bruce Church Inc., isn't there? $200,000 of every $700,000 crop has to go to increased packaging costs because of this Arizona law, and that's a pretty heavy burden on the local interest. So here the court finds that the local interest outweighs the burden on interstate commerce. Here comes our trucks and trains. Bibb versus Navajo Freight Lines. So, you know, most of our freight up until shortly after World War II used to be shipped around the country on trains. In fact, I don't know if you guys know, this still runs. There's something called the Salad Bowl Express, which runs from the Central Valley of Florida, and it ships fresh produce to the East Coast. And it's an express train that gets to the East Coast in, I don't know, 48 hours or something, some ridiculous short period of time. Eventually, of course, in the 1950s, President Eisenhower developed the interstate highway system, both for national security reasons and to improve commerce. And at that point, most of the shipping, the long haul shipping, ended up migrating from trains to trucks. And trucks are obviously a lot more flexible in terms of where it can drop the goods off and the like. So there develops this huge national long haul trucking industry that's shipping all of our goods all around the country. And over the interstate highways, by the way, and Illinois adopts a law that requires all trucks and trailers coming into the state to have contour mud guards on them. Now, I don't know what's the difference between a contour mud guard and a standard mud guard, but apparently the contour mud guard does a better job of preventing the truck's tires from spewing road material up onto the cars behind. You guys have, this has happened to all of us, I'm sure. Have you ever got a windshield nicked because a truck in front of you picks up, kicks up a piece of gravel and throws it into the windshield, right? I mean, that happens all the time. Yeah, and these mud guards are supposed to protect that. And obviously, Illinois is thinking about safety purposes in doing this. And by the way, this applies equally to Illinois truckers as it does to, out-of-state truckers as well. So if, Illinois is a big state. If someone's trucking from Springfield in the southern part of the state to Chicago, which is not the most northern part of Illinois, but it's in the northern part of the state, it's a pretty long haul. They would have to have the contour guards just as well as those who are shipping from the East Coast to the West Coast and happen to drive through Illinois as well. And you guys know that when you drive through the interstate highway systems, there's always a truck pulled over by a cop, okay? It happens locally as well. This is one of the great revenue raisers of all, because they want to prevent overweight trucks from driving. Overweight trucks ruin the roads, ruin the local roads. And then, these days the highways have weigh stations to do that as well. So, these proper contour guards are undoubtedly being looked for by the Illinois State Police as they drive around the roads. And by the way, truckers' fines are very heavy fines, okay, much heavier than you will pay for a small speeding violation or for talking on your cell phone or something like that, okay? So this is challenged, and the court holds that this places an unconstitutional burden on interstate commerce. And what it does is it sort of compares what Illinois is doing. It's doing the Pike balancing test, and it looks at the local benefit. And the local benefit is health, safety, and welfare, obviously. And it looks at the local benefit, and then it compares it against, well, what are the other states doing? And the effect of this is going to be, we either have to drive around Illinois or stop and put on contour mud guards before coming into Illinois. It's a lot different from say, someone who owns a motorcycle in New Hampshire who drives into Massachusetts and then has to take the helmet that he's not wearing off the back of his bike and put it on his head when he gets to Massachusetts. That's not such a burden, okay? Although motorcyclists would tell you otherwise, by the way. So this was found to be an impact on interstate commerce. Consolidated Freightways versus Raymond Castle, different result. Iowa says you cannot have semi trucks that are more than 55 feet in length. No semis that are more than 55 feet in length. There are some exemptions to this, but for the most part, that's it. Well, apparently there are a lot of out-of-state trucks that are 65 feet in length. I'm sorry, this is not a different result. So the court here examines the local burden, the burden on the local interest versus the burden on the out-of-state interest. And it says, there's not that big a difference between 55-foot trucks and 65-foot trucks. The state hasn't really shown that it's safer to drive in a 55-foot truck. And indeed, if you're going to drive in a 55-foot truck as opposed to a 65-foot truck, you're going to have to send more trucks through. this might actually impact the safety negatively because you have a higher chance of accidents if that in fact happens. So it shoots that one down as well, okay? You guys see that it's hard to predict where the courts are going to go in these cases? So
Definitely.
well, you can feel frustrated by it. It's frustrating when you're a law student to be given a rule that seems to be a fairly precise rule, and then the court does whatever it wants with it. And I'll just give you some solace by saying it's really not the conclusion that matters so much. You know, on a bar exam question, they're going to have to give you a black and white question, right? It's going to have to be fairly clear, factually. Or what they sometimes do is you'll get an answer. It says essentially that the outcome depends on what the finder of fact finds, right? So plaintiff will win if the finder of fact determines that the burden on interstate commerce outweighs the local interest. That would be a proper answer if it's a close call, okay? All right, here are the exceptions to the Dormant Commerce Clause, and then we'll get into privileges and immunities. The first is the so-called congressional approval exception to the Commerce Clause. So here, remember, the theory of this is simple. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 is the Commerce Clause. It gives Congress the right to deal with commerce with foreign nations, commerce among the states, that's interstate commerce, and commerce with the Indian nations, okay? So the authority to deal with interstate commerce rests with Congress. Congress is the king when it comes to interstate commerce. The whole purpose of the Dormant Commerce Clause is to prevent states from interfering with Congress's domain, which is interstate commerce. So if the states intrude too deeply into interstate commerce, even though Congress is not acting, the Dormant Commerce Clause will be invoked to prevent the states from doing that. But given that Congress is king, what happens if Congress says, hey, states, you can discriminate in this area? And how does Congress speak? It speaks by enacting laws, right? That's the only way Congress speaks, by enacting laws. Even a budget is a law. We talked about that back when we did the line item veto and the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act. We talked about that. So this exception makes sense. If Congress has created a scheme that allows discrimination against out-of-staters, well, then Congress has the right to do that because Congress is the king when it comes to interstate commerce. So here in Western and Southern Life Insurance Company case, California issued retaliatory taxes. If an insurance company came into California and the insurance company was from a state that charged higher taxes that on California insurance companies, then California would have issued to the out-of-state company, it will impose a retaliatory tax. And essentially, the bottom line is that California, through this McCarran-Ferguson Act, has allowed this, has allowed commerce restrictions on California's power to tax the insurance business, okay? The market participant exception, we got one case that's right on point. The second case here, I wish it weren't in the book. I'll mention it quickly as we go by it, but it's a little bit confusing, and it might belong as much in the congressional exception one. But here's the case that's right on point. Reeves, Inc. versus William Stake. South Dakota owns and operates a cement plant, okay? And it serviced a lot of businesses outside of the state of South Dakota. And Reeves, Inc. is such a business. And so for whatever economic reasons it has, South Dakota says, from now on, we are supplying to in-state businesses first, and if we have product left over, we'll then allow out-of-state businesses to purchase it. And Reeves challenges this. It's got to wait around for the South Dakota produced cement products. Is this facially discriminatory? Absolutely facially discriminatory. Strict scrutiny, it would be shut down. South Dakota would have to look at what the economic goals it wants to achieve are and consider non-discriminatory alternative ways of doing it. So for example, could you achieve the same thing if you did a lottery that both in-staters and out-of-staters were thrown into? Absolutely, right? That would achieve the same purposes and it would be non-discriminatory, okay? So clearly violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. Oh no, wait a second, it doesn't. Because here, South Dakota is not acting as a market regulator, it's acting as a market participant. It owns the cement production business itself. And so all it's doing is choosing among its customers in a discriminatory fashion, but that's okay. So the court fits this case squarely within the market participant exception, says this isn't really all about the Commerce Clause. This is just about a business person deciding, a business person, which happens to be a state, deciding how it's going to sell its product, okay? This is the case that it's a little more confusing. Here, wood products in Alaska have to be offered to in-state purchasers before it's issued to out-of-state purchasers. And the court essentially says it does not fit within the market participant exception. I find this case confusing. I think it might apply more into the congressional approval category, if anything else. All right, let's move on to the Privileges and Immunities Clause under Article 4. Privileges and immunities under Article 4. Here it is right here, Article 4, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. So the idea here is to move away from what was occurring with the Articles of Confederation to essentially say that out-of-staters can come in-state and do whatever activity they're going to do as freely as if they were a citizen of the state that they're in at the time. The states can't discriminate against out-of-staters, okay? Now, the couple of problems here, couple of limitations here. Number one, this only applies to fundamental rights. And we're going to talk later on about the fundamental rights, but I'm going to make this easy for you right now, okay? For our purposes right now. We're going to see later on that the fundamental rights include the right to marry, the right to procreate, the right to raise your children the way that you want to raise them, the right to privacy, which was discussed in the confirmation hearings of Judge Coney Barrett. I saw her in the news. I didn't watch them. Yes, I don't know why people watch Supreme Court confirmation hearings anymore. I have not seen a nominee for a Supreme Court seat who has said anything substantive in the past several decades. They just all come in now and say, that's hypothetical, I can't tell you what I think. And so either these are a bunch of people who have no opinions whatsoever, or they know that they don't want to get in trouble. And it's like, well, why are we here? Why are we wasting hours and hours watching these things? You know, it's kind of interesting.
You didn't see that she was asked a couple of constitutional questions, Professor, and she wouldn't
answer any of them.
Right, and she couldn't. She actually got one wrong. Like she couldn't name.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, ever since Judge Robert Bork got in trouble for saying what he really thought back in the 1980s, he said essentially that, you know, there's no right of privacy in the Constitution because it's not written anywhere in the Constitution. And that's just, you know, he was an originalist judge, and that's just judges who are expressing their own, sort of their own view of the Constitution and expanding it beyond where it should go. And well, the right of privacy, you know, provides us with the right to raise your children the way that you want to raise them. It provides us with the right to use contraception. More controversial is abortion falls under that right. It gives us the right to refuse medical treatment, so we can essentially pull the plug in our last days. I mean, all these rights we take for granted, and there was outrage, you know, about it. He was being truthful, and he was saying what he thought. He was an originalist, and he didn't get confirmed. So ever since then, virtually every single judge says, I can't answer that question. I might have to consider that as a judge, and I don't want to prejudge it. Or that question's a hypothetical question, and I'm not going to answer that. And that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg did that as well. The person who Coney Barrett is replacing.
Well, Professor, she forgot to say that under the First Amendment, there's a right to assemble.
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of rights under the First Amendment, and people forget, the right to petition government more often than not under the First Amendment, and the right freedom of assembly as well. I don't bother. I guess my comment was I don't bother watching those because they're not particularly helpful in determining whether the person should be on the Supreme Court or not, in my opinion. That process was sort of the horses out of the barn sort of a long time ago. In any event, let's get back to privileges and immunities. So fundamental right, but here's what we're going to focus on. Okay, you don't have to know all the fundamental rights yet. You will by the end of the semester. You don't have to right now. It focuses on one fundamental right, the right to earn a livelihood, the right to work, to feed yourself, provide shelter, take care of your family, the right to earn a living. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about in all these cases. As an aside, my second paragraph on this slide. We're going to have two privileges and immunities, actually technically not. The one under Article 4 is called privileges and immunities. When we do the 14th Amendment, we're going to talk about, actually next week, we're probably going to start talking about individual constitutional rights, sort of the lead up to the individual rights. The 14th Amendment has a privileges or immunities clause. And there's really no functional difference, between the and the or, okay? There is a functional difference between privileges and immunities under the 4th Amendment and privileges and immunities under the 14th Amendment. And what I'm going to tell you is when I took the bar exam, it was a long time ago, it was never a correct answer to find that someone won or lost because of privileges or immunities under the 14th Amendment. Because as we're going to see next week, the Supreme Court wrote the privileges or immunities clause under the 14th Amendment out of the Constitution, long time ago, okay? There has been one case, and only one case, that has been resolved since then under the privileges or immunities clause of the 14th Amendment, the Sayans case, which we'll cover, okay? And never again. That was back, I want to think, that was back in 1990, I think, or 1980. And then never again, all right? So when you talk privileges and immunities in this class, it's going to almost always be Article 4 privileges and immunities, not the 14th Amendment privileges and immunities. Almost always. Here, you know, we have the same thing, discrimination against out-of-staters, usually non-residents, okay? Because the Privileges and Immunities Clause, unlike the Dormant Commerce Clause, is straight out of the Constitution, it's applied a little bit differently, and you have to follow the constitutional requirements. One of the things we're going to see is there's no exceptions. So if there's no market participant exception, there's no congressional approval exception, okay? Some more points to discuss before we jump into these cases. Here, the only focus is whether there's discrimination on the basis of being a non-resident. There's no impact on interstate commerce that's involved, none of that stuff at all. Because we're not talking about the proper allocation of power, we're talking about someone's individual rights, the individual right to earn a living. When we do Dormant Commerce Clause, and they look similar, when we do Dormant Commerce Clause, we're talking about the proper allocation of rights in regard to commerce between the states and the federal government, okay? So there's none of these crazy balancing tests and the like. There is a balancing test, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. You have to be a citizen of the United States to bring a claim under the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4. Have to be a citizen, which means you have to be a natural person. You don't have to be under the Dormant Commerce Clause. So aliens and corporations can bring Dormant Commerce Clause cases. They can't bring Privileges and Immunities cases. Okay, so those are the big distinctions. Here's the analysis that the courts are going to lead us through, that these decisions are going to lead us through. These cases, I mean, are going to lead us through. Number one is their discrimination against out-of-staters. Number two, if there is, does the state have a sufficient justification for the discrimination? And what the law says is that the state is going to have to provide a substantial state interest that it's trying to protect. Sort of akin to a strict scrutiny case, which would be the case because we're talking about a fundamental right. Remember when we talked about the 3 levels of scrutiny back in the 11th Amendment? What's strict scrutiny? Race, national origin, alienage, fundamental rights. What's intermediate scrutiny? Gender, non-marital children status, okay? Those are the enhanced statuses, so to speak. Since the right to earn a living is a fundamental right, you're going to have enhanced scrutiny. There's a heavy burden on the state to justify the discrimination. Okay, Toomer versus Witzel. I'll get through this case fairly quickly. It's an early case that really kind of establishes it all. This is the fight between Georgia and South Carolina shrimpers. South Carolina imposes a regulatory scheme essentially banning Georgia fishermen from coming in within 3 miles of the coast and harvesting shrimp. This gets challenged. They say, what's the challenge? I'm a shrimper. I earn my living harvesting shrimp. You won't let me earn my living in your state because I don't reside in your state, okay? And the court here gives us the whole, background between, why we have the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Here, this is a clear violation of it because they're keeping Georgia fishermen out of the South Carolina waters. This case, United Board of Construction Trades Council versus Mayor and Council of Camden. Camden has a 40% requirement that people who are working on city projects be Camden residents. This is challenged, and the claim is that it discriminates against out-of-staters. Remember where Camden is located? Just over the river from Philadelphia. Camden's in New Jersey, Philadelphia's in Pennsylvania. So obviously the claim is that construction workers coming from over the border are discriminated against. Rehnquist says that this is in fact discriminatory. Even though there's discrimination against the New Jersey citizens who are not Camden residents, there is discrimination against out-of-staters. The in-staters at least have the ability of redress through the political process where the out-of-staters do not. Here's the test that we just talked about. Is there discrimination against out-of-staters? If so, does the state have a burden? Can it overcome its burden? Here, because of this procedural posture in the case, after Rehnquist said all of this, we're about to think he's going to say this violates the privileges and immunities clause of Article 4. We think he's about to say it, but he says, well, there wasn't really a trial here. There wasn't a lot of determination of fact. So we don't know if Camden has a substantial reason that justifies this discrimination that can overcome the discrimination. So we're going to remand the case for further consideration. One thing I have never been able to discover with this case, does anyone see, I'm back to the title of the case. Does anyone see a problem with the title of this case under the Privileges and Immunities Clause? And there has to be some undisclosed reason why this case was allowed to go forward under the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Does someone see a flaw here? You have to be a citizen.
Is it not federal?
No, you have to be a citizen to bring a Privileges and Immunities case. And who's the plaintiff in this case? It seems like a trade association is the plaintiff. And I've never been able to, I've researched this, I've never been able to, I don't know if it was bad lawyering and you know the city of Camden just never raised it, but I've got to believe the Supreme Court justices would have found this issue. So I can't explain that. It doesn't change, as far as I know, the rule that it only protects citizens. It doesn't protect corporations or aliens or foreigners. Well, it's not that old a case, and it's pretty clear right in the Constitution that it applies to the citizens. See, I mean, there you are right there, Article 4, Section 2. The citizens of each state shall be entitled.
Because could somebody challenge that? That would be what? You can
Well,
always.
I'm not, this is, I mean, I don't need you guys to guess on it because there's no answer to it. So I'm not testing you on it. I'm just saying there's something here that I haven't figured out myself, is why this case was allowed to go forward. In any event, so, you know, just bear that in mind. Baldwin versus Fish and Game Commission of Montana. Apparently Montana has great elk hunting, and people come to Montana to hunt elk from all over the country. The problem is that Montana charges higher licensing rates for elk hunters who come from out of state than residents have to pay who come from in-state. And Baldwin doesn't like this, so he challenges it, and he says, this violates my privileges and immunities. Is there discrimination? Absolutely, against out-of-staters. Absolutely. Why does Baldwin lose?
It's not a fundamental right.
Yeah, thank you. Is that Jade?
Yes.
This is recreational hunting. This is not someone trying to make a living. This is not this is not like a guide who has to pay a higher price to earn a living guiding people on hunting trips. This is just some dude who wants to come in and shoot elk for recreation. So there's no fundamental right involved in this case. Finally, and this is the big case, this is the one that everyone cites, New Hampshire versus Piper. 1985 case. When I was admitted to the bar in 1981 after law school, I considered taking some judicial clerkship positions in New Hampshire and Rhode Island, with the Supreme Court of New Hampshire and the Supreme Court of Rhode Island. I was a Boston boy and I wanted to practice in Boston, so I didn't. Not sure I made the right choice in hindsight, but that's a different question. Judicial clerkships are wonderful opportunities. At that time, that was before 1985, I was admitted to the bar in 1981. I graduated from law school and was admitted to the bar in 1981. I would have had to have moved to New Hampshire to be able to take the New Hampshire bar exam. And the reason for that was at the time, New Hampshire had a residency requirement. To take the bar exam, you have to be a resident. I'm sorry, they let you take the bar exam, but they won't admit you unless you're a resident of New Hampshire. So Catherine Piper lives in Vermont. She took the New Hampshire bar exam. She passed the New Hampshire bar exam. She went to be admitted and they denied her the ability to become a New Hampshire attorney because she didn't live in New Hampshire. She then sued, saying that this violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of Article 4, and the court agreed with her. Is there discrimination against an out-of-stater? Yes. Is she a citizen? Yes, Catherine Piper. That's a citizen of Vermont, okay? Is she claiming the denial of the ability to earn a living? Yes, she wants to earn a living practicing law in New Hampshire. That doesn't mean that 100% of her living has to be by practicing in New Hampshire. She also makes some of it by practicing in Vermont, but New Hampshire is preventing her from being able to do that, okay? Seems to be a violation. Now, the question is, does the state have a substantial enough reason to prevent her from doing that? And look at the reasons that New Hampshire came up with, and they're pretty lame reasons. There's nothing really approaching substantiality here at all. Well, non-New Hampshire lawyers are less prone to familiarize themselves with New Hampshire's laws or rules. Well, if you don't do that, you're going to end up being disbarred because it's unethical to practice law without knowing the rules and the laws, okay? So that's crazy. Less likely to follow the New Hampshire rules of ethics, same thing. There's pretty strong, motivation if you're practicing in New Hampshire to follow the New Hampshire rules of ethics. Just so you know, never a good thing to lie to a judge, okay? Never a good thing to lie to a judge. You won't be a lawyer very long if that happens. Less likely to be available for court proceedings. Remember, you have an obligation to your client, ethical obligations to your client that are going to get you to the court proceedings. And if you can't do them, then you're not going to take the case. Less likely to do pro bono, or other volunteer work in the state. At the time, New Hampshire did not have a mandatory pro bono requirement. So the court says none of these rules meet the substantiality test. All of the states, as a result of this, there are a lot of states who had a residency requirement. A lot of states had residency requirements. Since this case, obviously none of them have residency requirements anymore, okay? Here we are, folks. You guys have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Tuesday, okay?
Okay.
And we're going to move on. I think the next section is our introduction. Before we get into the individual rights themselves, we have these introductory materials. They're going to sort of lead us in there. So we're going to be starting that on Tuesday. You guys have a good weekend.
Thank